Okay. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Brother Karim. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you too,
I
bro.
missed you last week,
Oh, well.
and let's see. Um, I see you have a new headset and microphone.
Yes, but I still have the same old head. Just
Yeah, the
kidding.
same old head. Well, let's pray that Allah keeps that same old head working
Inshallah.
for several years to come, so that we
Inshallah.
can finish the task of this. I suppose the task of this heading for vanguarding the revisionist movement that's taking place in our old and aging generation for the new people. We're getting some flack from the traditionalists. They're calling us kafir now. And I suppose I welcome that. I'm disappointed that this happens, but this is exactly what we're talking about, isn't it now, brother? This has been going on for quite some time. If you don't agree with me, you must be kafir. Is their attitude, their position, and it turns into a kind of a bloodlust after a while, which follows the trail of those who suffer from compounded ignorance. And that's just the way of it. That's the psychology of it. That's the sociology of it. And we are not experiencing anything new uh, at this particular point in the history of Al Islam. This is what happens. This division comes, people disagree, they can't agree to leave each other in peace, even though they call their religion Islam. Now, that's a remarkable event. And so that comes out of some sort of fear. And all this sort of fear is a basis or has a basis in a lack of faith, actually, because once one activates that faith, there's nothing that can move you. You could be in the worst storm on the boat or in the worst prison, and you still have this peace. But these people don't have it, and they can't leave others alone who do have it. And that's the problem. So, we have been talking about the use of reason and how our traditionalists oppose that and have opposed it almost from the beginning. And so I want to back up a little bit towards that beginning. We've talked about the mass murder of the philosophers and the Stasi like state that executed these men and women. Of course, there were women amongst them as well. So, um, what happened, in the Hijaz and in Arabia, northern Arabia there, we've covered some of that, but we haven't talked about what happened south and west of the Hijaz in Egypt. Now, we know that there was, in the generation that followed the death of the prophet, we know that there was trouble in Egypt already, and this trouble manifests itself as a result of nepotism that was practiced by Umar, whom the Egyptians murdered. And just to remind people, correct me if I'm wrong, Hadrat Umar appointed his nephew to rule over Egypt. Well, let me say, this is a bit like me coming into your house, converting you to Egypt, and then appointing my nephew to rule over your house. Um, I don't think you would like that. The Egyptians certainly didn't like that. And we know that there are elements in society who will take advantage of such an injustice. And we also know that without justice, Islam has no walls. And without the walls of justice, anyone can enter the house of Islam and begin to destroy it from within. And so that's my position, even as a uh, un, as a non-traditional scholar in Islam's history. I do know some things about this history, and I've questioned these things, and it seems no one wants to talk about them. No one wants to talk about the nepotism. No one wants to talk about the welfare that the righteous caliph, the welfare state that the righteous caliph set up, you see, to distribute all this, mm, what was it, Jizra, whatever was being collected, all these taxes. They just, oh, well, we're the original Muslims. We get a piece of the action now. It seems to me that some of this became a gangster-like mentality. We're the boss. You're under our jurisdiction. You pay for protection, and we'll see that you're protected. And if we don't pay for the protection, we'll see that you're destroyed and ruined. Now, that doesn't sound like much of an Islamic position to me. I always pondered this, I always questioned it, and no one wanted to talk about it. So I'm going to bring it up here and ask you to respond in just a minute, because what happened here is that the Egyptians murdered, or some Egyptians murdered, Umar, and this began a civil war. And the Ummah has never recovered from that civil war, to the best of my knowledge. As a result of that civil war, the Qurayshi, they got back their estate. They returned to the nepotism of the monarchical system of government. They dressed it up as a caliphate, but that's essentially what it was. And then we had the troubles that followed, which I call keeping up with the Khans. You see, it's a kind of a competition. You know, your wife looks out the backyard window and she sees your neighbor has put in a swimming pool, and then goes to complain to you about it. So you don't have enough money for a swimming pool, so you got to go steal it, right? And this is essentially what happened. I don't care how you want to dress this golden age. This golden age was really magnificent, but that was a facade, as far as I can see. And if it wasn't a facade, Genghis would never have sent his sons to destroy Baghdad. Now, having said that, let's go back to the murder of Umar and this Egyptian stream. It never stopped. This Egyptian undercurrent of dissatisfaction. Because, why do I say that? Because 200 years later, with the ascension of what has become traditional Islam, with all these hadiths, um, many of which are fabricated, and I've heard some scholars say recently, well, there's only 2 or 3 thousand out of these 100,000 plus hadiths, which are actually authentic, if we want to use that term. So, then which ones are they? Where's the book of the 2 or 3 thousand authentic hadiths? Oh, no, we can't have that. We have to have confusion, you see. And I don't think Allah is the author of confusion, because when I look at the divine order in nature, everything is perfectly ordered. So why would we have confusion reigning amongst the hadith scholars? And why can't they just say, okay, well, this is the book of the 2 or 3 thousand hadith. These are the ones that are really authentic. The rest of them we just can ignore. If you want to look at them, that's fine. But no, that's not their attitude. Their attitude is you must consider them all, as we do, and we're not going to tell you which ones are the true hadith, because, well, we're the ones who know. We understand the classifications. You don't, because you're just you're a non-madrasic graduate. You're just a pedestrian on the street. So you'll have to listen to us. And if you don't listen to us, we're going to call you kafir. It's pretty much like that, isn't it, brother? So 200 years later, we have the ascension of this traditionalist perspective of the hadith. Not that I'm disrespecting the hadith, especially those which may be authentic. It's all still a science of hearsay. You can maybe funnel it down, spit it out. You can have a pretty good idea of what may or may not be authentic, as long as it fits in with what is in the Quran. And if we follow the tafsirs, that's pretty hard to do sometimes, because these tafsirs are infected with the ancient Jewish traditionalism. So we've got traditionalism in the tafsir, we have traditionalism in the hadith, and where does this leave the pedestrian? Well, it leaves the pedestrian at the mercy of the tyrants, doesn't it? At the mercy of the priesthood. And so now we're at that mercy, at least intellectually and academically. We're kafirs, brother. So I submit to that mercy. I don't have much choice. It's like water off the duck's back for me, but there are some people who would really be upset by this. I'm not. I'm concerned about it, because our concern is genuine. Our concern is to get at the truth of the matter. And I'm trying to discern that. I'm trying to narrate it. We're trying to define it as best we can from this distant position. You see, we're 1400 some odd years later after the fact. So 200 years after the death of the prophet, these hadith appear, and lo and behold, what happens in Egypt? There's the rise of this Fatimid kingdom, one of the most horrible and horrid samples of tyranny in world history. And they dare to call themselves Islamic. Well, dear brother, what can you tell us about this relationship, if there is a relationship, between the hadiths and the rise of the Fatimids? There must be some streams of influence here that have joined in some sort of spiraling, descending circle of influence that have completely removed the Muslims from the path. Because this is not the middle path. The Fatimids were definitely not the middle path, and neither were the Hadith. So, my dear brother, we have tyrants on both sides of the Nile, and can you relate them for us in any which way?
Yes, thank you. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, another opportunity to share some thoughts with you in these meetings. I'd like to begin by addressing a point you made earlier about what is the source of the confusion, And there's a verse, I think, which is relevant in the Quran, in Surah number 10, verse number 100. Allah tells us that He will put confusion on, or the Arabic word is rijz, which is sometimes translated as abomination. In that verse 100 in Surah number 10, Allah is telling us that He will place confusion on certain people.
Mm-hmm.
And who are these people that He promises to put confusion on? He actually promises to confuse them. Who are these people? Well, according to the verse, they are the people who do not use their reason. You see? So this makes perfect sense. I mean, who would not become confused that refuses to use his reason, the akal, you see?
Yes.
And in that connection, I'd just like to add another point. I have been reading Brother Omar Ramahi's book, The Muslim's Greatest Challenge, which is been published in 2019. It's available on Amazon. He sent a copy to me and asked me to have a look at it, so I'm doing that. So in the course of looking through the book, I came across an interesting passage where he confirms something that was stated in one of our clubhouse rooms by one native Arabic speaker. I think his name is Brother Shaukat. He and his son would have a room on Clubhouse, and they went through the entire Quran, a translation, and the father would comment on the translations. And one point that he made, which struck me, and which was confirmed by Dr. Omar Ramahi in his book, which he made, was that the Arabic word kalb, which is normally rendered as heart,
Yes.
actually does not mean heart in
Oh.
original Arabic. It means heart. Yes, it means heart in modern Arabic. But in Quranic Arabic, the word kalb actually means brain. Brain. Exactly. So when the
Oh my
translation,
God.
exactly. So when the translation says that they have kalb with which they comprehend not, it is actually a reference. They have brains with which they do not comprehend. You see. And yeah, and Brother Omar Rama, he confirms this rendition of, and he's also a native Arabic speaker, I think born and raised in Saudi Arabia. He's now an engineer at the University of Waterloo in Canada, which is an outstanding university. I think their math department, according to a former friend of mine, is the second best in the world after the University of Moscow, so to speak. But I'm getting off the subject here.
Sure.
So Brother Omar Ramahi confirms that the word kalb in original Quranic Arabic means the brain. So here we see another instance of where the exegetes, traditional Muslim exegetes, have altered the meaning of an important Arabic term to repress reason, to give the intellect a bad reputation, to discourage people from using their reason. They are trying to assure us that our understanding takes place by means of the heart rather than by means of the brain. And one other point I'd like to add to that is that when I was still active as a research fellow at the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies here in Malaysia, where I was a research fellow for nearly a decade, and I was practically Professor Dr. Muhammad Hashim Kamali's right-hand man. I did a lot of editing for him, then I also edited other papers, then I began to do some of my writing. So among the papers, the early papers I wrote was one on critical thinking. It's available, it's on the public domain. It's called, I think, Enhancing Critical Thinking Skills Among Muslim Students. And as I was writing that paper, I also became aware of something similar that happened with the Arabic here. You see, Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran several times, La tattabi'u ahwa'akum. That means do not follow your desires. But the Arabic scholars, the exegetes, have interpreted the word hawa to mean they refer to the hawa as capricious opinion. In other words, they attach the word opinion to the word caprice.
Oh my God!
Exactly.
So?
Absolutely.
This is this is this is something that is deliberate.
Yes, it is deliberate. Obviously, it amounts to doing violence to the Arabic language. And it also amounts to distorting the meaning of the Quran, of Allah's words.
Yes, of course.
This takes brazen audacity to do something like this. But anyway, it's very manipulative. And so I checked with a friend of mine whose Arabic was better than mine at the time. Together we went into the library, looked into the Hans Wehr dictionary, and looked up the word hawa, which is this. And I discovered that the word opinion is not among any of the connotations of the word hawa. Hawa means lust, caprice, desire, and all that, but no word mentioned about opinion. So you see how this illustrates again how the traditional ulama corrupted actually the meaning of Arabic terms as years went by to put down the intellect, to repress reason, and to pave the way for blind following of tradition known as taqlid.
Yes.
So yeah, this brings me to another point which we discussed earlier, and I'm coming to the Fatimids in Egypt shortly. I want to add a clarification to what we were discussing last time, and highlight one important fact, which is that the persecution of thinkers actually began earlier than under Musa al-Hadi. Already his father, who was the third Abbasid caliph, his father began persecution of free thinkers, Zindiks or Zandaka as they were referred to, already as early as 785. And many people were killed. And by the way, they had an office called the Office of the Muhtasib for that. This office began originally as the market inspector, but his powers were broadened to include kind of political supervision. He became something like a political commissar, you know, in Soviet Russia. So checking, and if anyone reported anyone for having, for doing free thinking, he would take it upon himself to observe this person and, if necessary, invite him to a caliph to explain himself, and if he did not repent his free thinking, he would normally be put to death. So, yes, and this practice was actually given a name. It's called Mihna, or the Inquisition, which actually started even. But you see, the irony here is that when you speak to traditionists, they will not tell you about this or the slaughter of 5,000 philosophers. What they will tell you that this Inquisition actually was done by the rationalists, starting with Al-Ma'mun. And I don't deny that an Inquisition took place under Al-Ma'mun, and they also committed some excesses. I don't think there's any denying that. But whatever they did pales in comparison with the slaughter of the 5,000 philosophers that was perpetrated by the son of al-Mahdi, Musa al-Hadi, and he did it at an early age when he was, I think, 25 or 26 years old. And another point I should add, that this policy... So, and this policy of the persecution of rationalists was continued, unfortunately, also by his younger brother Harun al-Rashid for some years, until he reversed himself and began to appreciate the works of Greek mathematicians and scholars, and the whole process of translation of works of knowledge from other languages began. And I believe the Bait al-Hikmah was also built around that time. And also, I believe the story of 1001 Nights basically refers to the period of the rule of Harun al-Rashid. So I just wanted to, and by the way, so in other words, the persecution of rationalists did not begin with Musa al-Hadi, but had an earlier beginning. Actually, you could argue that it even started under the Umayyads, who began persecuting the so-called the people that believed in freedom of the will, and as opposed to the predestination. The Jabrites were known as the people who believed in predestination, and the Qadarites at that time were the people that believed in freedom of the will. And the leader of these people that believed in freedom, including freedom of the will, was someone called Mabad al-Juhani, and he was beheaded by Marwan in 699. So my own, reading and work in this area tells me that what we are witnessing here is several things taking place at the same time. First, we are seeing a movement away from the Quran, facilitated by the repression of reason and by the repression and persecution and even extermination of the rationalists. I also see, at the same time as what is taking place here, is a rise of despotism, limits on human freedom. And also I see a change into more like a despotic form of government, as you know. And in this connection, I might also add, in relation to Omar, that he actually stopped making the payments of zakat to new converts, whereby he departed from the instruction that we find in the Quran, which I think was quite terrible. And he shouldn't have done that, because he basically disobeyed Allah. Allah said the people who are to be converted to Islam, or who have converted to Islam, they have a share in the zakat money. But he put a stop to it, you see. So now, the other thing I'd like to mention, and this is bringing me closer to the Fatimid issue. You see, when you look more closely at this, at these events, you begin to sense that there was actually a little bit more to the whole story than we have discussed so far.
Yes, of course.
It wasn't just the rationalists versus the rationalists. The traditionists. It wasn't just the Ahlul Quran, whom I suggested were pretty much the same people as the Ahlul Rai, the rationalists, versus the Ahlul Hadith. But there was another element here, you see. And that was the Sunni Shia split. A lot of the Shias were more favorably inclined to the use of reason than traditional Sunni Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
And so the persecution of the rationalists probably was to some extent, in some ways, also a persecution of the Shia, you see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So now the Shia, as you know, are Persians. And because of all this persecution, I would explain the rise of the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt as a result of this persecution of the Shia by the Arabs. They needed a
Mm-hmm.
place to escape to,
I
and
see.
Persia and Egypt were there for as it were, for them to migrate. You see,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how they established themselves.
Oh, I see.
And
Well,
so
then you
now,
have lands on either side of the two great rivers. You've got the and you've got the Euphrates and Tigris there, so they can cross either one and feel relatively safe.
yeah, one other point I'd like to add. You were asking me last time, where did this happen?
Yeah.
Well, the persecution
Yeah.
of the philosophers. Well, it happened in Baghdad.
Mm-hmm.
And this fellow, Musa al-Hadi, by the way, he moved his headquarters before he died from
Mm-hmm.
Baghdad to a place about 100 miles northeast of Baghdad. And this place has an interesting name. It's
Mm-hmm.
called Haditha, after the word hadith. Can you believe it? so, he, so, so he moved physically to the place called Haditha, and perhaps intellectually he also moved, as it were, from Quran to the Hadith, and abandoned the Quran in favor of the Hadith. You see. So
Yes.
I just thought I should point that out because it seems
Sherlock
to be
Holmes and Dr. Watson would have a field day with that now, wouldn't they?
absolutely.
So we have this division early on between what became the Shia. They were not Shia to begin with, obviously, but and before they were Shia was just a word that meant sect, a different group of believers who believe differently. Okay, and now you're identifying them with the more with people who like to use their reason. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with that, I say. And just as a matter of fact, I met many Iranians and still have some relationship with Iranian professors and students, and I find them much better informed than the traditional Sunni sects, if you will. So, not that I'm in the least bit agreement with the Ismaili or Shia persuasions, but if you were to ask me who would I prefer to sit down and have a discussion with, I would have to say with the Shia because they're much better informed about other worldly matters, and I'm concerned about worldly matters, as I think we all should be. I'd like to be as well versed in science and, the various types of sciences, not just the so-called quote unquote Islamic sciences, you see, that they like to offer as science, when in fact it's not hard science at all. It's just another form of metaphysics. So we have this division early on before the Ishmaelis became what we call the Batanites or Batinis or assassins in all these various forms of ludicrous theological persuasion. So it seems to me that the division was taken advantage of by other forces, which I'll defer to other discussions. Let's go back to your perspective on this, dear brother. Thank you so much for it.
Yeah, in that connection, I'd like to mention something that came up recently in one of our clubhouse rooms. We were
Mm-hmm.
discussing the meaning of the word Shia, and of course,
Mm-hmm.
we were reminded by someone among the speakers that the word Shia, which we already knew, but we were reminded that Shia is someone who is a member of a sect, a sectarian.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of suggested, well, if the Sunnis are also sectarians, if the Sunni Islam is also a sect, then we could say that the Sunnis are also Shias. if you see
Yeah.
what I mean.
Mhm.
In other words, they also, but I'm also I made it half jokingly. The other point I'd like to make, is that you are right. I also have some friends of Persian or Iranian background, and I found them to be highly educated, very civilized, very polite, easy to
Mhm.
talk to, enlightened, and what have you. However, I would add that I have met people of that class or sort also among some Arab,
Mhm.
people. The one thing that they had in common was all these qualities like articulate, knowledgeable, polite, civilized, reasonable. In
Mhm.
other words, and I sometimes think of it. They are the sort of people that you would wish to have for friends.
Yes.
And let me mention just one example. I mean, I had the chance of attending a meeting where the former ambassador of United Arab Emirates to
Mhm.
Russia mentioned an interesting point one time about the Muslim Brotherhood. When they came to the United Arab Emirates, they presented themselves to the Emiratis there as, we are the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Emiratis responded by saying that, well, if we are the Muslim Brotherhood, who are we?
Yes.
So anyway, so I was fortunate because we had many people come and go at the institute, sort of the cream of the crop, so to speak, the diplomatic
Mhm.
corps and what have you, scholars. So I was lucky that I have met, people on both sides of the divide that you
Mhm.
can speak to, and I hope that the dialogue continues. And I think one of the good things that the United Arab Emirates is doing is they are building a complex of Abrahamic faiths. It will be completed this year, I believe. And they will have 3 buildings, one for Judaism, one for Christianity, and one for Islam, to, emphasize the common heritage of the Abrahamic faiths. So
Mhm.
I think they are trying to reach out to the other communities rather than in other words, they're trying to be inclusive rather than be exclusive, as you
Mhm.
find them among some of the hardcore Salafis and others who subscribe to a less tolerant, form of Islam. So
Yes.
I thought I should mention that, in
Yes.
relation to the earlier comments. But the recently, about a week ago or so, I had a strange experience. My laptop broke down, and
Mhm.
so I discovered the hard drive was faulty. So
Mhm.
for about 2 or 3 days, I was without access to a computer, and I kind of felt like a fish out of water. But
Mhm.
what happened was that I was forced to go to a public place, into a shopping center, and rent one of these computers for about $1 plus an
Mhm.
hour. And
Mhm.
I wanted to write, but I could not easily access my data banks of quotations, you see.
Mhm.
So I was forced to write without using any of, which is my habit, using quotations from various scholars to buttress my case. So the
Mhm.
paper is actually already has already been written, and it has been published. It's on Amazon, and it kind of gives an overview of the research the study that I have been doing. And
Mhm.
among the conclusions that one of the things I have included in that paper or that book, which I did, that text, which I did not in the earlier publications, well, because I didn't become aware of it until just maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Mhm.
And this insight came to me one time in the morning after, or as I was praying the Fajr prayer. It occurred to me that, hey, wait a minute, the Muslim ulama say, they have this, I think I may have touched on this earlier in our last discussion. The
Mhm.
Muslim ulama have this concept of the mukallaf, the legally competent person in full possession of his rational faculty.
Yes.
And from a legal point of view, he would be, such a person would be considered sane.
Mhm.
On the other hand, someone who is not in full possession of his rational faculty could not be considered a mukallaf, and from a legal point of view, he could not be considered sane. You see,
Mhm.
he would be considered as someone who is bereft of reason. So then I realized that, wait a minute, the Muslim ulama made it a condition to refrain from the use of reason in order to understand revelation and to follow revelation.
Yes.
So, in other words, they disqualified themselves en masse from being considered as mukallafun, you see,
That's
as
right.
legally competent persons.
Yeah.
So the entire corpus of
Mhm.
exegesis and jurisprudence that we have, which is based on refraining from the use of reason, therefore, I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, I'm putting this out on the table for discussion.
Yeah.
And some of the people that are giving us the blowback, I would like them to consider that too and see what answer they can give us to this. But all the tafsir and jurisprudence produced without the use of reason, to me, sounds like it is rendered by that fact that reason was not used in arriving at these conclusions. All that research is rendered unreliable.
Well, you have to limit that definition because the use of reason is constrained within a certain mindset. So what they've done is they created this traditionalist mindset and they limited their use of reason to this mindset. And there may be some overlap with other uh, sets of, rational thought which are accepted, but this use of reason is limited. So that doesn't make them completely out of their minds, but it does remove them from the set that would be considered truthful, you see. And that's quite a blow, you see, because let me restate that fully truthful, because they have some truth, but they cannot exhaust their reason to disclose and expand on that little bit of truth that they do have, because they've closed it off. They've closed off the use of reason. So that makes them less than spiritually mature.
Yeah, yeah.
Put it that way. Mm.
Yeah, in fact, so my and as I was writing this up, and I have developed some of these points in some of my previous writing, I basically realized, and I'm becoming more convinced that the refraining from the use of reason basically explains almost everything that went wrong in a Muslim civilization.
Yeah.
Because with the refrain, first, with the characterization of the use of reason in
Mhm.
understanding religion as a form of kufr or disbelief, and there
Mhm.
are hadiths to that effect. You can find two of them in a book by Abdul Zaid called Quran and Introduction. And also there's a paper by Adis Duderic on academia where called Neo-Salafism, the case of Abu Amin and Bilal Phillips. He, in that paper, he refers to hadith according to which the Prophet allegedly said that the use of, quote, reason-based tafsir is a form of kufr. So, in
Mhm.
other words, we are not allowed to use reason. And in traditional Islamic thought, reason or akal or the intellect is subordinated to nakal or tradition. And even my
Yeah.
own former boss, Professor Mohammed Hashim Kamali, writes in his
Mhm.
jurisprudence book that the fuqaha basically insist that we have to follow even the weakest hadith, and even when it is, these are his words, quote, even when it is, quote, against the dictates of reason, end of quote.
Mhm. Oh
So to
dear,
me, this is a catastrophic development,
that
and
is
in
that
itself,
is catastrophic. Yeah.
an unreasonable conclusion. And
Mhm.
also, it shows a certain confusion on the part of the juries, because, as I
Mhm.
may have noted in our earlier discussion, reason for them was good enough to arrive at their classification of the hadith, right?
Mhm.
So how can you classify the traditions? How can you determine
Mhm.
which is actually a prophetic tradition and which is not without using reason? So,
Mhm.
and ijtihad cannot be carried out without the
Mhm.
use of reason.
Yes.
Ijtihad, after all, is juristic reasoning.
Yes.
So you see, after relying on reason to develop their so-called science of hadith, they then throw the reason or rationality under the bus, so to speak, saying, we don't
Yes.
need you anymore. We have our
Mhm.
system. So, and that was just one, the turn
Yes.
from reason to tradition, the subordination of reason to tradition was just the first disaster, I think. There was a series of others followed. The next one was, as I mentioned, the misunderstanding of the Quran. You
Mhm.
cannot, I don't believe anyone can understand anything without using reason. And then
Mhm.
came the characterization of the Quran as, due to the failure to use reason to its maximum capacity, came the characterization of the Quran as three things: unclear in parts, incomplete, lacking in detail about, for instance, it doesn't provide the details on how to pray, and number three, self-contradictory. You see, the ulama, some of the ulama, exegetes claim that Allah actually contradicted himself up to 500 times in the Quran. Now, this is
Yes.
outrageous.
Yes.
How can they make such a statement? So now, because this all is happening because of refraining from the use of the reluctance to use reason. So they did not realize the contradictions in their own position. And I have mentioned one other contradiction before, remember in our talk last time, which is that on the one hand, the ulama claim that the Quran is the first source of the Sharia, as Al-Shafi says, followed by tradition, followed by ijma, and then followed by reason or juristic reason or ijtihad. But at the same time, when it comes to tafsir, they reverse the relationship between Quran and Sunnah by claiming that the Sunnah now judges the Quran, you see. So my question to them is, and I'm not alone, by the way, Taha Jabir Rawani also pointed out this inconsistency in his book called Reviving the Balance, IIIT 2017. How can you maintain that, tradition is both subordinate to and equal higher than the revelation, yeah. Because in fiqh, in jurisprudence, they say tradition is subordinate to revelation, but in tafsir they say revelation is subordinate to tradition. So, isn't there a problem here? so this
It's a big problem, brother. It's
yeah,
a
a big problem. Yeah, and they subordinated revelation of Quran to the Sunnah in at least three ways. One, they claim that the Sunnah explains the Quran, a judge or judges the Quran. A Sunnah Qadi al-Quran. In Arabic, that means the Sunnah judges the Quran. The Sunnah explains the Quran. So a judge is always in a superior position to that which is being judged, correct? Secondly, they also claim that the Sunnah can abrogate the Quran. And according to Al-Wani, the majority of the ulama already as early as 660, in other words, less than 30 years after the demise of the Prophet, already agreed that the Sunnah can abrogate a Quranic verse. And they agreed that even a solitary hadith ahad can abrogate a Quranic verse. As happened, so they allowed the words of human beings to abrogate the words of God. This is also another disaster, as happened, for instance, in the replacement in a punishment for apostasy by death, which is drawn from a hadith, while Allah does not give any punishment for apostasy in this life, you see. So and then they replace the third way in which the ulama have subordinated revelation to the tradition is basically by saying that the hukum of the hadith can replace the hukum of Allah, the rulings of Allah. So once again, they have allowed, man-made reports to overrule and replace the rulings of Allah. I refer to it as juristic shirk, and to the equality of the hadith with the Quran as being both wahi, which is what they claim. I refer to that as textual or scriptural shirk. So the traditional exegesis or tafsir and fiqh or jurisprudence are both tainted by these, what I call scriptural and juristic shirk. So this is all due to the sacrifice of reason on the altar of tradition. And by the way, the whole process didn't end there, because in the end, the ulama threw under the bus not only the revelation and tradition, but they also threw under the bus tradition also, and they basically declared themselves to have the highest authority in interpreting, both tradition and revelation, as John Esposito put it in one of his essays. According to them, ijma, or the consensus of the scholars, overrules everything, right? So this created, serious aberrations in exegesis and jurisprudence, and these aberrations require attention. One of the unfortunate effects of these, failure of logic or breakdown of reason or paralysis of reason, if you like, was the adoption of the two doctrines. One, the doctrine of abrogation, and the other one was the rejection of causality and the adoption of the doctrine of predestination. So now the first adoption of the doctrine of abrogation was very problematic, because it enabled the jurists, the hawkish ulama, to transform Islam as a religion of peace into Islam as a religion of war, by claiming that a single verse in the Quran, Surah number 9, verse number 5, which is the so-called verse of the sword, kill them wherever you find them, is often quoted out of context from it. They claim that this one verse abrogated 120 other verses of the Quran, all of which talk about peace and reconciliation. So to me, this was a massive tampering, and the reinterpretation is too soft a word. This was a massive tampering with the meaning of the Quran, and it basically turned the teaching of the Quran, of Islam, in fact, upside down. They transformed the religion of peace into a religion of war by doing
Can you
this.
put that verse into context, brother, for us, for our listeners?
Sure. So that verse was, is one of the few verses. How do I put this? There's an excellent paper, perhaps I should say, by Nias A. Shah, that's Shah, called, published by Oxford University Press and also published by the European Journal of International Law. The article is called "The Use of Force in Islamic Law." Excellent article. He does an excellent analysis of that verse, and he points out that this command to kill them wherever you find them was given to the Muslims in response to an act of war, basically, by their adversaries when they broke a certain treaty that they had with the Muslims, you see, by aiding some of their allies in the killing of some tribe that was allied with the Muslims. So this verse was, it does not give authority to the Muslims to kill disbelievers anywhere and any time just because they are disbelievers. No, not at all. This verse was part of the doctrine where the Quran permits and even requires fighting, but in self-defense only. In other words, it allows defensive jihad, but does not allow offensive jihad. So that was the context, of the verse. So it's, in other words, it has been misinterpreted not just by non-Muslims, but by Muslims as well, unfortunately. And as Muhammad Asad says in his commentary on a very similar verse, number 29 in the same surah, which says, fight them until they pay the jizya. This is sometimes treated as a second verse of the sword. These verses have to be read in context with all the verses on fighting in the Quran. And when you do that, you will realize that these are by no means a justification or legitimation. They do not constitute or provide justification for the forceful conversion to Islam by the sword on the part of the Muslims fighting against non-Muslims. So this was the whole Jihad al-Talab, as it is known, has been very seriously. This is actually a bid'ah, an innovation, which with no foundation in the Quran. There's another interesting commentary on this in a book called Tackling Takfiri Theology. It's available online in PDF format, published by the Quilliam Foundation of the UK. The editor, one of the editors, is Majid Nawaz, and the authors are Saleh Ansari and Osama Hassan. Osama Hassan sometimes writes for The Guardian, so they also do an excellent analysis of this, and point out, for example, that among the people who accepted the doctrine of abrogation was, and also the doctrine of jihad, aggressive jihad, was none other than Imam al-Shafi. I was shocked because hundreds of millions of people follow Imam al-Shafi. And he is not alone, by the way. When you dig more deeply into this issue, you will find that even people like al-Mawardi, Imam al-Ghazali, also support the doctrine of jihad al-Talab. In fact, according to Ibn Rushd, or aggressive jihad, the majority of the Muslim ulama subscribe to the teaching of aggressive jihad, that Muslims have an obligation to spread Islam by the sword, and then this is a sixth pillar of Islam according to them, and that they have to do this once a year. So are you surprised that Islam developed a reputation as being a violent religion when our own scholars are teaching this kind of nonsense to the masses? I'm shocked. I'm totally shocked.
I have read sociological studies that have examined terrorists who have reformed, by the way. And most of these papers that I edited were in Malaysia at the time. I continued editing even after I left Malaysia for many of the scholars who were publishing these papers, most of whom were actually authors who were sitting on the fence of traditionalism, if you will, and looking at this from a more scientific perspective. And they determined, and this includes the intelligence services, people working within the intelligence services, including the military and the police, they all concurred that there were external influences at work that utilized this position that you've just described to justify terrorist activity. You see, the killing of innocents, including other innocent Muslims. You see, which are the result of terrorist bombings, things like that nature. They say, "Oh, but this is all in the cause of Allah." And we're defending ourselves, or we're expanding true Islam by force of these terrorist activities. And so this is nothing new. What you're describing, dear brother, is a politically correct reductionist mindset that is held by a certain element of the traditionalists who may not even be aware that some of these great so-called fathers in Islam, you can liken them to the church fathers, if you will, have subscribed to this position. I bet you many of them don't know this at all, you see, and yet they are willing to defend, at the cost of your blood, maybe even my blood, their position, you see. And this is one of the points I would like to get across to our listeners today. This is not the Al-Islam that our beloved Prophet gave us. It is not the Al-Islam that is defined by the Quran. It is not. So I would encourage anyone who listens to myself and Brother Karim and others of our ilk who are trying to elevate the Muslim heart to the Muslim mind, you see, to listen and consider these matters, because they're very serious. And it is a cause of confusion. And when you have confusion, especially theological confusion, you see, there is no confusion in the divine order of the created universe. None. There's no confusion in it. There's no confusion of our understanding of this divine order. When you understand this divine order, there is no confusion. But where there's confusion, there is injustice. And where there is injustice, external forces can enter and cause this sectarian division. Okay? People ask me, well, who is your imam? Who is your sheikh? What sect do you belong to? What madhab do you belong to? I say, I'm a Muslim. I don't ascribe to any of these sects. I'm an eclectic Muslim. Okay, so let us return, if you will, dear brother, back to this influence that allowed the Fatimids to create their own little kingdom by maybe initially giving shelter to the sectarians who were unacceptable to what became traditional Sunni Islam.
Yeah. So, how do I put this? One issue I have with the Shia perspective, I have to admit, is that their doctrine of the 12 infallible imams, as I have mentioned on Clubhouse, the attribute of infallibility is exclusive to Allah. I think they should retreat from that. Yes. And also they should ease up on the enforcement of religion, as is happening in Iran these days, where not wearing the hijab was made into a crime. This is another form of extremism. In fact, I read a paper by an Iranian scholar of all people who was writing in reference to his own country and other countries, that one of the problems that we witness in Islamic jurisprudence is what he called the criminalization of sin, end of quote. So once again, partly because some of the Muslims are not using their reason, their rational faculty to its full capacity. Some of them seem to be losing the ability to make very important distinctions, for example, between crime and sin. The two are very different. According to Mustafa Akyol, in his book called Reopening the Muslim Minds, Muslim juries have identified more than 100 crimes while the Quran only mentions 4 activities which are considered as crime: murder, adultery, theft, and slander. Even verse 33 in Surah number 5 is not a legal verse, according to Muhammad Asad. The verse about crucifixion and banishment and cutting off the hands and feet on the opposite side, because Allah uses the present tense in that verse rather than the future tense, as happens in all the other legal verses. So careless reading of the Quran, poor low-quality exegesis, resulting from a deficiency or unwillingness to use reason. These are some of the, why we Muslim traditional Islam and political Islam also have distorted the original teaching of the Quran. We need better exegesis. We need better fiqh, and that has to begin with a return to reason. This is not easy because in traditional Muslim thinking, the use of reason, as I mentioned, was identified with kufr, as it were the treason of reason, if you want to put it that way. There's also a concept of fikr al-kufr, according to which the very act of thinking can make you become a kafir. So this bias has to be overcome, and we need to bring back. Can you show me one Islamic university which has a faculty of philosophy, for example? I have not come
A
across
faculty of what?
philosophy.
Oh, philosophy, yeah.
Yeah, so philosophy has acquired a very bad reputation, and as you know, that mihna that I was talking about earlier, the persecution of the thinkers, resumed under Mutawakkil, and in a way, Al-Ghazali put a finishing touch to it in his attack on the philosophers. But now, so the rise of the Fatimids was basically, as far as I can tell, a kind of response to the persecution of non-Arabs, Persians in particular, by some of the Arabs, their ethnocentrism and nationalism and Arabism. So, as you know, there were some bloody fights, and they started between the Sahaba already. Muhammad Shahrur points out that in the first 2 battles of the first fitna, the Battle of the Camel and the Battle of Sijil, 15,000 Sahaba died in just these 2 battles, you see. So, yes, there was a lot of politics here, and I think the problems with traditional and political exegesis and jurisprudence can be traced to to a significant extent to the influence of politics, you see, on the interpretation of revelation and on jurisprudence. As Muhammad Shahrur points out in his book called Quran, Morality and Critical Reason in chapter 6, which deals with politics, he refers to this unholy alliance between scholars and caliphs. You see, the caliphs needed a rationalization, a justification, a religious justification for waging wars of expansion. And some of the ulama were happy to oblige, and they provided it by adopting this very problematic doctrine of abrogation, with which they utterly distorted and corrupted the message of peace of the Quran. So I think both political and traditional Islam are basically a result of this repression of reason that happened at a very early time in Islamic history, in the struggle between the so-called rationalists or Ahlul Quran on the one side and the traditionists or the Ahlul Sunnah on the other side. So this issue of the proper relationship between these 3 factors, revelation, reason, and tradition, needs to be rethought and re-articulated, because I think it has been very badly distorted in both traditional and political Islam. And by the way, the political Islamists include not just the names I mentioned, Mawardi, Shafi, and Al-Ghazali, but the modern writers they also include Ibn Taymiyyah, Sayyid Qutb, and Maududi. You see, they all basically jump to the conclusion through, I think, poor exegesis, poor tafsir, and conclude that we Muslims have a responsibility to enforce morality and enforce religion on the people, while the Quran doesn't say that. And by the way, the same fellow I referred to earlier, Omar Zaid, he points out in the last chapter, I think in a conclusion to his book, that another example of the distortion of the meaning of Arabic words can be be found in a way the tradition has interpreted the meaning of nahi. Nahi, they rendered as tahrim or a prohibition, but it actually means discouragement. It occurs in a famous phrase which the Islamists like to use to justify spreading Islam by the sword. The verse where Allah says that you are the best community, ummatan khairan, because you command what is good and prohibit what is evil. That is the usual translation. You do what in Arabic is called amr bil ma'ruf wa nahi anil munkar, but the word nahi does not mean prohibit. And it does not mean prevent either. Some people go so far as to render it as prevent, which entails some use of force. The word nahi actually means discourage. So the ulama have again misinterpreted, traditional ulama and political ulama have misinterpreted the meaning of this Arabic term to have a connotation of force or forcing religion on people. But you cannot do that. It runs contrary to many verses in the Quran, not just the verse which says that there is non-compulsion in religion, but other verses too. Let him who wants to believe, and let him who wants to disbelieve, let him disbelieve. So Allah says in the Quran that He has bestowed dignity on the children of Adam. You cannot have dignity if you are being forced to believe this or to believe that. So the people who are trying to force morality and ethics on people and religion, I think they are acting in defiance of the teaching of the Quran. And one other point I could mention in terms of the corruption of the meaning of words, Al-Shafi reinterpreted the word hikmah in the Quran as meaning the sunnah of the Prophet. It doesn't mean sunnah of the Prophet, it means wisdom. You see, so here's another instance of tampering with the meaning of Arabic words. Perhaps I can add one more. The word mutashabihat in verse 7, surah number 3, is rendered as ambiguous. It does not mean ambiguous. It means allegorical, implying something, a similarity between two things. Tashabahat qulubuhum in Arabic means their hearts are similar. So once again, you see, they misinterpret that the meaning of that word to justify going out of the Quran to the Hadith now to clarify these allegedly unclear verses. This is once again very bad tafsir, very bad exegesis, and once again resulting, I think, from the failure to use reason to its full capacity. So I think
why have our academics ignored this irresponsible translation? I mean, this is the epitome of academic irresponsibility.
absolutely, but as people say, they have jobs to protect, mortgages to pay. So, and the Japanese have a saying: "The nail that sticks out gets hammered." So
I
they are.
see. So they've adopted the politically correct position.
Yes, exactly.
And that's why we're being called kufir.
I suppose you could say that. People are scared to say anything different because they fear of being accused apostates. And according to traditionalists and
Yes.
political Islamists, apostasy carries the death penalty. So this Muhammad Shahru refers to this threat as a form of a death threat for apostates, as a form of, quote, intellectual terrorism, end of quote. And I don't think
That's
he's
what it
off the
is.
mark.
No, that's what it is. That's exactly what it is. That's adab. Yeah, according to great Professor Alatas, that would be adab, precise definition. That's what it is. Political terrorism. That's what it is. And that's what we're discussing here, dear brother. Goodness me. The more I talk with you, the more shocked I become. It's not, it's not that I didn't expect to find fallacy. I expected to find fallacy. You find it in the histories which have all been rewritten by the victors, one way or another, in any of the religions, in any of the national archives. You're going to find these fabrications. You're going to find these falsehoods. But in the religion that professes to be the representative of the final revelation from our creator, our source creator, as Brother Bilal would say, is shocking to see such a stream of it. One thing after another, after another, after another. And all of these misinterpretations, deliberate and otherwise, are very serious.
Very
They bring
serious.
about very serious misconception. And our politically correct academic brothers are silent. That's outrageous. That's outrageous. It's just as outrageous as the medical authorities being remaining silent about the COVID bioweapons that are now at large and ravaging the earth. There's no difference. Well, actually, there is a difference. The Muslims who are irresponsible, the academicians in Islam who are acting irresponsible here, have the graver offense. The onus is graver on them, you see, because they are professing to defend the truth, professing before God and before men to defend the truth. Outrageous. May Allah have mercy on us. So, dear brother, let us leave it there for the moment, and I hopefully will next meeting, inshallah, next week, will delve a little bit more into this Safavid divide. You see, this is the first time that I've heard anyone saying, okay, well, we've developed this Sunni or the origins of this Sunni sectarianism, and they called the people who didn't believe them, they called them sectarians, Shia. Okay, so and then something happened, external influences which are still active today that have that have brought about the terrorist activities, which are very, very real. You see, they've brought them about and they've activated them. They brought about this division between what is now Sunni and Shia 1,000 years ago. Inshallah, we will discuss this further next week. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.